Hello and welcome everyone to today's episode. Today we are going to be covering the following topics. All the timestamps are in the description below. And I hope you enjoy today's episode. So let's get started on these topics. Let's have a look at EnsureDeleted over here and see why is it useful in entity framework application in C#. So here, it's a simple application that basically will insert a few records into a database and it will query the output such as the age over 20 and the name is sorted in ascending order. And here we have a class that basically captures the ID, the name and the age and the city of the student. Notice here the question mark next to the city. This is to enable the city to be null values. So it is optional for the person inputting the data to provide a city. And here you can see we're creating a table, essentially DB set is equivalent to a table in a database. You can see we have a student table over here. So let's see if we can update the city of our students to be London. Okay, so as you can see, this is the statement. So all I'm doing is updating en masse city for these students. So if I execute this, then you can see 3 records were updated. So now if I highlight this and execute this code over here again, and you can see the city is now London for all the students. So this is where the problem arises. If you are not working in development and you're working on production, whenever this code here runs, it would actually go and delete the records in that table. It will actually delete the table. So if I run this code over here, and you can see the code has run, and if I go back to the database here and execute the query again, you'll see the city has become null again. So we have lost our changes that we made. So what it does is it deletes the table and recreates it with the default data that we seeded here. So that's why you should not use EnsureDeleted in a production environment and should only be used when you are doing testing on development for in a very sandbox contained environment, because sometimes even on development you do need to be able to keep history because of any test cases that may have been keyed into the database. So rather than using EnsureDeleted and EnsureCreated, we need to use migrations with an entity framework. But before we can use the migrations, just like with entity framework, we have to install this package. But with migration, there is an additional step that we need to do, which is install .NET tools. So what you need to do is in Google, you need to search for this term over here, entity framework migrations, and you will get this link over here from Microsoft. If you click onto that, then you'll be taken to this page. On this page, you can read about the entity framework migration overview, but the bit that we need to do is getting started. So what we need to do is install the tools. So in order to install the tools, you need to click on this link over here, .NET Core CLI tools. And once you are on here, so on this page, you can then scroll down, and here you can find the install the tools, and you can install, for example, .NET Entity Framework over here. So you can just copy this command and then run this in terminal. But I prefer to install the tool sets locally. So what I want to do is I want to use this locally within just my project. So you need to click onto this link, and then you need to copy this command and then go over to your VS Code, and then you need to bring up your terminal. So view terminal, and here I'm going to cd into this console1 application. So I have now changed my directory to this folder. So I'm going to paste that command in and press enter. And what this will do is it will create a new file within your project, which is within the configuration here. You've got a manifest file here, which will be used to track which tools are installed. So if we go back to the browser now, so now we've issued that command. Now what we can do is copy this command, but we'll exclude the global switch here. So we will now go back to VS Code, and what we want to do is we want to exclude the global. So I'll just delete that and then copy that out again and then paste that. So the tool is now successfully installed. So, but you can see the message here that it's installed version 9.07. So if we have a look at our .NET tools file now, and you can see that we now have .NET. So under the tools, we've got .NET EF, and this is the version number that we've installed. The next command that you need to use is this one, which is a package reference that you need to add. So if you copy that command now and go back to your VS Code and back into your terminal, and press enter. And once this is stored in your folder, so again, when you go to your CS prod file, you can see the entity framework design reference is package reference is now included. And that's all you need to do to get started with migrations is install the tools. So remember, if you don't know how to get to the terminal, you just go to file, view, and then terminal, and this will bring up. And remember to change your directory to your individual project name, because that's where within the config it will install .NET tools. So now we have entity framework tools installed, whether globally or locally on your computer and with a new project. So we went for this option, which is locally, but you could use the global one as well. So I'm using the same project that we had before. So now we can get rid of these two lines because we don't want the database to be created. And then what we're doing is over here, we want to add a new city, but we first need to create our initial migration. But if we have a look at our database, we can see our table already exists and it might already have some records in production. So we don't want to overwrite that. So what we need to do is create an initial migration. So if we go to file over here and view terminal, and once you get the terminal, you need to change the directory to your current project. So that would be cd and then type in con. So that's our console one application. And then I'm going to use the autofill by just pressing the tab and it will recognize I meant the console one app. Just enter. And then I am going to paste this command in. And what this command does is it's called .NET tool. And if we run the .NET entity framework migration, then we're going to add a migration code initial create. So you can see build started, build succeeded. Okay, and this is how you can remove this action if you wanted to. So remove the last migration. So now let's see what has actually happened. So it has created within our project folder. So this is our project folder console one. It has created a subfolder called migrations. And if we expand this, and you can see there's initial create, which is the name we gave here. So we added this name and it's put this timestamp over here. So we are going to click into that. We're just going to have a look. So here, what we can see is we've got initial create migration. This is what we called our migration name. And you can see it's doing a couple of things. It's going to create a table and it's going to add the columns that we have in our class and so on. And yeah, in order to migrate down, it's going to drop those. So we have two options. One, which is we do not want to lose our data that we already have in the table. So we could simply get rid of these. So in this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment out these lines from here. Or we can simply delete the code from within here and it won't actually do anything when we apply this migration. So now within the databases, you can see we just have the one table, but as soon as I apply the migration, so here I've run this command, which is .NET tool run .NET EF and database update. So this command is generic. You don't need to change it every time you run it, and it will apply any migrations that haven't been run. So if we now have a look at how do they track all this, if we look at our database here and fresh, and you can see there is now a table called migration history. So if we select that, and you can see that it has added the migration ID over here, and it has added the product version. So that's the migration tool version that it's put in there, not your application version. You can see this name matches with the migration that we have here. So it's got a timestamp and then underscore initial create, and you can see it's the same one. And this product version actually comes from within our .NET tools. You can see it's version 9.07. So now we have created our initial migration, and you can see that this has been applied to the database, but it has not dropped our table or deleted any records. So this has been an empty migration because we deleted the code from the up method and commented out the code from the down method over here. So previously you can see we had a migration code initial create. And what we did was within this migration, we removed the code for up method over here and the down method because we didn't want to delete any data from our tables. If we look at our SQL Server over here, you can see our table had the following data. So we didn't want to get rid of that data or damage it. So we removed and just created an empty migration. And if we have a look at the migration itself, you can see that's what we called the migration. And notice here the product version again. This product version refers to the .NET tools version and not your application version that you are building. So now let's say we want to add in a new column called city. And for existing data, we want null values in here. How do we do that without manually entering the SQL Server table over here? So going back to migrations, what we'll do is we'll close this one down and we'll add a new property to our student class because that's how our table is created using the DB set over here. So we're just going to add a new property. So we'll use the VS Code shortcut of proc, press enter. We're going to change the data type to string. And we're going to make it nullable, so it can have no values because our database already has some records. And then we're going to change the property name to city. So now we have this. We're going to go to our terminal. Now, before we go to our terminal, we need to make sure we save the file. You can see this dot to indicate it's not saved. This is now saved. So we'll now open up the terminal, the hamburger menu, click on to view and terminal. And we are going to use the following command to add our migration. So we're going to use the .NET tool and we're going to call our migration add city. But as previously you saw, we have a migration called initial create, which is what we named it. So now we should get something called add city over here. And you can see this command is finished. So if we have a look at the folder structure for migrations folder, you can see there is now a migration called add city, which is the name that we give over here. And this name appears here. So if we have a look at the structure of this method here is simply adding in a new column called city within this table students of a following date type. And it is a nullable field. And you can see here where the down method is actually just basically going to drop that column as city in table called students. So this hasn't been applied to the database yet. So what we can do is we've got an option of removing this migration if we change our mind. But if we are okay with it and we want to apply it to the database, so this command here, database update, is the one that actually will do the work. Previously we used the migration add command. And if you want to remove the migration, you use the migration remove command. So I'm going to run this command and you can see it has succeeded, has applied the following migration. So here the name of the migration as you saw is this. If we go back to our database and if we refresh this table by executing again, and you can see we have a new migration which matches what we had in VS Code. The product version of course is the same because we're using the same .NET Entity Framework tool. And then if we now do a select on this table, you can see there is now a city column and the city column has null populated for any existing data. So by simply using a few commands and adding our property here to the class, we have automated the process of adding the new column to a SQL Server using Entity Framework. So previously we applied this migration to add city to our database. So you can see here we added a migration called add city. And if we check our database, so you can see in the database we have a new field called city. It has null values for existing data, and you can see here within the migration history, which has been automatically created by Entity Framework, we now have add city in here. So let's say we changed our mind and we wanted to get back out this column and we wanted to go back to just the 3 columns we had initially without manually reviewing this within SQL Server. What we can do is just simply back out the migration we applied here. And basically in order to do that, what we need to do is we just want to go to the previous migration, which is this one over here. So we just want to go over to this one and get rid of this migration over here from the database. We will go back to VS Code. So back in here in VS Code, so you can see add city migration. It actually has the relevant code. So this is the method to promote it to production into your database. And this one is the down method. So these have been written by Entity Framework for you. So you don't have to manually write them. So what we need to do is bring up our terminal. So we'll go to hamburger, we'll go to view, and then we'll click on to the terminal. And in this one, we're just going to change our folder to our application. And now we're going to run this command, which we ran previously, but this time we are going to give it a name of the migration that we want. So in this case, the migration name that you want to switch back to is this initial create. So now we have this migration in initial create. Notice we just type this part of the name of the migration, so we don't have to type the full name. And then if I press enter, then you can see that the migration has been reverted. So reverting migration add city, so it's gone back to the initial state. So if we have a look at our database, if I refresh this table, which is the one that's managed by Entity Framework, you can see now the only migration that exists is the initial create and the other one has disappeared. Within the database itself, if I requery this, and you can see the column has been deleted. So if you wanted to run the migration back in the new one that you have, you can just delete the migration name and then press enter, and you can see the migration will get applied again. So add city has been applied. Then if we have a look at the database, if I do a select on this, you can see that city has been added back in, and then within the migration history that's been added in. So if we just back out the migration one more time and go back to the initial create migration, what we can do is it leaves the files here. So add city is still a migration file that exists here. If we want to remove this one, then we need to use this command here, which is .NET EF migrations remove, and this will actually get rid of the migration file from your migration folder over here. And then you can basically start again by creating a migration if you wanted to. So if I run this command over here, so here we want to add it back in because let's say we changed our mind once again, you can just run this command, and what this will do is it will recreate the add city file for you, migration file, and then you can apply this to the database. So when you run the .NET tool over here, here and you run the migration command and you add a migration code, add city. So for example, over here, what we are doing, we're adding a new column to the backend database called city. What actually happens and how does Entity Framework.NET tool applies this migration? So let's have a look. So when you run this command, it's going to start a build over here and then it says build succeeded. Now, if we have a look at our folder here, so migration folder, and have a look at the add city migration file ending with .cs, not the designer one, the add city one first. So this is the main file that is probably of interest to you. So within this file, there's an op method here. And what this does is it's used to add the city column. So you can see the add column of type string and the name of the column will be city. Table that it's going into is students and this is the data type. And you can see we've got the nullable. This is because in the code, we made the data type nullable. And then you can see that another method called down. And what this down method does is it removes or drops a column, a code city, it's in the table code student. So this is self-explanatory and this is the main file that it generates. And then you can see we've got the designer. This is a helper file used by Entity Framework. And you can see it mentions the columns that are not part of the migration, but you can see ID column is there and it's half of type int. We've got the age column and then we've got the city column over here. So you don't really need to modify this file. If you remember when we did our initial migration, what we did was we went into the down and the up methods and we cleared them out because what we did was we created the database before we wrote the code. So the database was already there. So we didn't want Entity Framework to recreate it. So we came in here and created an empty migration. So we let Entity Framework generate the code like this, but we deleted everything from this method. Just as, for example, we can turn the add city into an empty migration by simply going in here and deleting everything from here and from the down method as well. So what this will do is it will apply the migration without recreating the tables that already exist. So that's what we did with the initial migration. So if we have a look at initial, so that's initial create design, you can see here, it's got the following columns is identified. I would only recommend deleting the contents of up and down methods only for the initial migration. Otherwise you may end up with issues with the designer file. So I would only recommend it for the initial create and not for a second migration such as add city. So we have our database here, which has 3 columns, ID, name and age. Let's say we want to add in another column using Entity Framework called city. So what we need to do is in VS Code, I'm going to add in a new field called city. It will be nullable by adding this question mark next to the data type. So it can have null values. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use the Entity Framework tool here, which is a .NET tool. And we are going to use within the Entity Framework, we are going to use the migrations module. And we are going to add a city migration. So here I've just called it add city. So when I see my migration, for example, over here within the migration folder, I will not then see in the add city migration. So if I run this over here, and as you can see, build succeeded and my migration have been added over here called add city. Now within the add city.cs file over here, what you can see is it's added column called city and the column is nullable and is of type bar chart. And this matches what we supplied here in terms of the data that we wanted. So this hasn't been applied to the database. So if we go over to our database, you can see if I refresh this, you can see we still have the same number of columns, ID, name, and date. So when we do apply it to the database, what will Entity Framework actually do? So we know that it uses these up and down methods here to upgrade and downgrade our database. So here it will drop the column and add the column. But what actual script can we actually see the SQL script that will do that? So you can run this command, which is called the .NET EF migration script. And you can see that it will generate the relevant script that it's going to run. So what you can see here is what it will do is if the migration history table is not there, it's going to create that. And then it's going to insert the following values into it. And then you can see it's going to issue the further table command and add a column called city, which accepts nulls. So this is the actual statement it will run. And then it will run and insert into the migration history table the following value, which is the name of our migration plus a timestamp. So when we run this command over here, this will actually issue the following SQL against the database. So if I were to now run this command and you can see it's finished. And if we go over to our database and if I refresh the columns, and you can see city column has now been added. So if I do a select from the table, you can see the city column have been added and it allows for null. So essentially you can use this command, which is the .NET Entity Framework Migrations script command, and this will let you view the SQL script. So previously we added a new column called city to our database using Entity Framework. But one thing we noticed over here is that the city column has a data type of varchar max, which is probably not something we want. So how do we force a data type change using Entity Framework? So here, as you can see, this is our class over here, student class, and you can see our city column is over here, and we're using this string data type. So what we can do is we can use something called data annotations. And the way data annotation work is just above the field name that we want to apply a certain condition. So in this example, we want to change the maximum number of characters allowed in the database. We can access a data annotation attribute here. So this attribute max length, and in the parentheses, we can specify what length. So what we want to do is we want to add in a length of 100. And what this will do is it will amend the column if we add it through the migration. So the very first time we add it, that's fine. It will just specify that length. So if we look at a previous migration that we added, you can see the data type it went for was varchar max. So what we can do is we can add in a new migration now. So we're going to bring up our terminal by going to view and then terminal. You have to use the terminal for this because we are trying to add a migration, and this is the only way to do it. So we're going to change the folder to our project folder over here. So once we are in the project folder for this application, console1 application. So now we're going to add this migration called reduce city length using this command. So we're going to press enter. So now that the migration has been added, let's have a look at our migration folder over here. And in here, you can see we have reduce city length, and this migration, you can see its up method over here is issuing an order statement. So you can see the order data type was varchar max, and this time we're changing it to varchar 100, and the old one was nullable and the new one is also nullable. And you can see the down method, which is to downgrade back to its original state, which is basically reversing the parameters over here. So we're changing varchar max over here, whereas previously it was varchar 100, because this would have, if this is applied, then we want to downgrade. So we want to go back to the state that we were in. So just before we apply it, you can see it's varchar max over here. Using the terminal, we are going to run the following command, and you can see our command has finished running. And if we go over to our database, and now if I click on the refresh button, and you can see the length has now changed to 100 over here. So in summary, you can see that by using the max length data annotation attribute, we can change the property city, and the data type is then limited to 100 characters, and it uses varchar 100 in the database. A very important thing to understand with data annotations and entity framework is not all of them work as intended. So here you think there's a data annotation called min length, which is the minimum length for this property of this class. So you would think that this would get applied to the database, but that's not the case. For example, this will be useful in an ASP.NET model validation, but this doesn't translate to a database. So if I were to, for example, here add this migration, so what we'll see is here we'll see a new file appeared, and let's see what actually happens. So we've added this data annotation. So let's run this command, and as you can see, the build has succeeded. So by virtue of this data annotation, we expect that it will make changes to the backend database. But let's have a look at the migration file. So we can see the migration file added here. So minimum length constraint file here. So if we have a look at this, so you can see the up method is empty. There is nothing in this up method. And if we have a look at the down method, you can see there is nothing in the down method. So this tells us that no changes will be applied to the database. So now let's remove this migration by running this command over here. So we run this command, and you can see the model has reverted. So this file, as you can see, has been crossed out and deleted. So it no longer appears within our migration folder here. So what you need to do is within your DB context class, which is inherits from DB context, this is where we are configuring the connection. But there is another method you could override, which is on model creating. Now, this is something to do with the Fluent API. So we won't go into too much detail, but this is the place where you would add any custom constraints as shown here. So you can see this is a check constraint. Then we are adding that the length of this column must be greater or equal to 3, and this constraint is being added to the student class and to the database. So this essentially can be removed over here. And now let's save this. And now if we reapply our migration over here, and if we have a look at the files over here, And now you can see that in the up method, we do have a check constraint being added, and this is the custom SQL for it. And you can see here the down method actually just drops the constraint. So if we go over to so here in the database, you can see we don't have any constraints at the minute to this table. So now we're going to update the database by running this command, and you can see our migration has been applied and is done. So if we now refresh our constraints here, so just right click and refresh, and we should see there is now a constraint of minimum length. And if we script this out, and you can see that it does have that the name must be greater than or equal to 3. So going back to understanding, so some data annotations won't actually lead to any changes in the backend. So then it is important to understand that you can actually use method within the DB context on model creating, which lets you do custom manipulation of the backend database, add things such as constraints to your database using entity framework.